which are emerging, and particularly in the past few months really, that's been looking at household dietary diversity and production diversity in the household, in agricultural households, to sort of elucidate how agricultural interventions can better target nutrition outcomes. There's also been some work in Zambia that's been looking at child diet diversity and its relationship to production in the household, and I don't think we've seen very much on women's dietary diversity, and there isn't really very much of this kind of analysis in Nepal. So really what we set out to do was to understand what's the relationship of household production that encompasses both crops and livestock, and to women's dietary diversity in that household. And we're looking at the analysis by agroecology in Nepal. As you all may be aware, Nepal has a very distinct agroecology, with the Terai being the sort of plains, and where a lot of agriculture is concentrated. You have the hills, which is sort of the middle of the country, and then you have the mountains. And they have very, very variable types of production patterns. And I know that Keith and Rolf will probably go a lot more into the details of Poshan as a study across these three agroecologies. But just to give you an idea, for this analysis, I'm using what is Panel 1 Poshan survey data, and that was collected in 21 sites across the country. It's nationally representative. 4,286 households, and of which there were about 4,509 women. We estimated the women's dietary diversity score using FAO guidelines, and one thing was that we could estimate 8 food groups, not 9. It turns out that there is a breakdown of animal source foods into 5 different categories, and the way our data was organized, we could break them down into 4. But it means that all the data has been collected. It's just been broken down by 4 categories. And as I said, production diversity is a count of all crops and livestock species produced and raised. We used Poisson distribution analyses to fit the models, and we accounted for clustering using generalized estimating equations. So here's the map of Nepal, and these are the nationally sampled districts, of which one site was one VDC, which is a Village Development Committee, was randomly selected, and of which 3 boards were selected. Essentially the way we have the survey set up is that they are done annually. So the one that we are looking at is basically for May through July of 2013. There's another panel that has been done in 2014, and there's been a partial panel that's been undertaken in 2015 because of the earthquake. So I just want to focus a little bit on the descriptive statistics of the 3 major variables that I want to discuss in this presentation. First is production diversity, and what you're seeing is the means and medians as necessary for production diversity, women's diversity score, and market distance. And what you see is in the hills, I want you to look at the second column, the production diversity is about 10.75. It's lower in the mountains to about 7.9, and it's the lowest in the Terai, which is more of a specialized production system. So it's about 5.8. The women's diet diversity, interestingly, is the highest in the Terai. It's almost 6 food groups, and the lowest in the mountains. And then we have the market distances, which are essentially about, this is in miles, it's about less than a mile in each of the agroecologies. But obviously when you're in the mountains, 0.9 miles really is actually a lot of climbing up or climbing down to go to the market. So I'm going to not spend a lot of time on this because this really is going to be addressed in Keith and Rolf's presentation, but I just wanted to put out that we did the diet diversity score where you're doing a count of food groups, but if you look at it and you drill in and see the quality of the diet, this is what the food groups, this is the frequency of consumption by food groups by women, and what you see is that there is a very low consumption of animal source foods, dark green leafy vegetables, and this is the median frequency of consumption, vitamin A-rich fruits and vegetables. So, and I'm going to leave it at this because I think this is going to come out very nicely in Keith's presentation. And then shift over to the Poisson model. This is the regression model, and what you have is essentially all the parameters that were introduced. We did this in a little bit of a stepwise process, but I'm showing you the final model which accounts for all the different variables that we wanted or we were hypothesizing. So the first one you see is that the production diversity, which is a count of all the crops and livestock grown in that household, is significantly but negatively associated with women's diet diversity. It's a very small effect, but it's a negative effect that you're seeing. In terms of the hills and Tarai compared to the mountains, they are much better. Women's diet diversity is much better in the hills and the Tarai. And when you look at the production diversity interaction with hills, this is where the negative interaction comes out. That is, in the hills, you have, where there is high production diversity, you have lower women's diet diversity. And this isn't surprising because if you look at the data in the hills, the plots of land, and there's very high diversification for probably low return. And we have to really drill in and see what kind of crops are being grown there. Now, the other thing to point out is that this is something that has been observed in other studies, and I'll talk a little bit about that in conclusions, where they say that there is a certain threshold beyond which if you increase production diversity, it's not going to make a difference. And that in fact it becomes either a non-significant relationship or it becomes negative, which is what we are observing. What's key here that I want to point out is market distance. The effect of market distance is much, much more stronger on women's diet diversity in the overall model. And what that's saying is that the further away you are from a market, the lower your diet diversity as a woman in that household. And you see that that negative relationship is actually is primarily in the hills. But it's not a significant one. When you put it in the overall model, it does, as an overall, it does become significant. And the last thing is that off-farm income really does matter in Nepalese households, irrespective of agroecology. It does have a very strong effect on the women's diet diversity. So, of course, we could have a lot of household variables that could affect these relationships. It's very easy to say, oh, there is a relationship even if it's significant and it's very small. So we have to do robustness checks, and we essentially control for the type of household, whether it was a male-headed or a female-headed household. We looked at the household education, household head education, excuse me, what's the age of the household head, farm size, household size. We incorporated all these variables and the relationships were maintained. We still found that production diversity overall was negatively associated, and that's primarily because of what's happening in the hills. Market distance was still negatively associated, and off-farm income was still significant and positively associated. We tested differences, splitting up production diversity by whether it was crop diversity or livestock diversity. We also tested for using expenditure instead of using the income off-farm and on-farm income variables. I do want to point out, because one of the concerns when you're using income variables is that the absolute values are based upon recalls. And so what we did was, one of the things that was recommended in literature was to actually convert it to a yes or no response. So we actually used a binary variable to look at off-farm versus on-farm income. So we removed that whole sort of issue of absolute values. So what's in conclusion? First of all, we definitely know that production diversity is relating to women's dietary diversity. It's a small relationship, but it's significant, but it varies by agroecology, so it depends on where you are. Irrespective of where you are, market distance is negatively and strongly associated, much stronger than the production diversity to women's diet diversity relationship, as is off-farm income interactions. So really, I mean, this is, I think, it's a very small analysis that was done, but what we find is that when you're thinking Nepal, when you're thinking agroecologies, and you're thinking agricultural interventions to improve nutrition, especially if you're thinking about production diversity, it would really be important to consider these differential effects that are being observed. I think the next presentation is really going to actually focus in on linking the production of nutritious foods to the consumption of nutritious foods, which will then take this argument further. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope I kept my time.